It has been 1 year since Queen Elizabeth II passed away. The departure of Queen Elizabeth also signifies the end of the generation of the World War era. Besides being a Queen of England, Queen Elizabeth was also the only woman in the royal family who played a role in the war. On September 13, 1940, shortly after the German bombing campaign began in large and small cities in England, 5 high-explosive bombs were dropped on Buckingham Palace. The Blitz was the German bombing campaign against the United Kingdom in 1940 and 1941, during World War II. Germany conducted mass air raids on industrial targets, small towns, and large cities. The capital London was bombed by the Luftwaffe for 57 consecutive nights, and more than 1 million homes and buildings in London were destroyed or damaged, and more than 40,000 civilians were killed. Instead of fleeing the attacked city, King George VI and his wife Queen Elizabeth chose to stay at Buckingham Palace, in solidarity with those living through the events. From the outset, King and Queen Elizabeth were determined not to hide from the war. Although Queen Elizabeth tried to keep her family together at Buckingham Palace, but at the peak of the Blitz campaign, Princess Elizabeth and Margaret were evacuated to Windsor Castle, to avoid the threat of German bombing. When the war broke out, Princess Elizabeth was only 13 years old. Like many children living in London, Elizabeth and her sister, Princess Margaret, were evacuated to avoid the dangers of bombing. They were sent to Windsor Castle, about 20 miles outside London. The 2 young princesses were among more than 3 million people who left the big cities for small towns and rural areas during the war. On October 13, 1940, Princess Elizabeth was tasked by Prime Minister Winston Churchill to deliver her first speech from the living room of Windsor Castle, as part of the Children's Hour program on the BBC, to boost the morale of the separated children, as part of the evacuation scheme. As the war progressed, Princess Elizabeth advocated for more aspects of life and resilience during the wartime. In 1943, she was photographed tending to her land at Windsor Castle, as part of the government's Dig for Victory campaign. Dig for Victory was a campaign urging people to use gardens and any available land to grow vegetables to help combat food shortages. Before World War II, England relied on food imports from around the world, but when the war started, shipping was threatened by enemy submarines and warships, resulting in food shortages and rationing of items like meat, butter, eggs, and sugar. On her 16th birthday morning, Princess Elizabeth conducted her first inspection of a military regiment in a parade at Windsor Castle. She was appointed as an honorary colonel of the Grenadier Guards, symbolizing her military involvement in the war effort. After experiencing the bombings herself, and witnessing the many effects of the war that had ravaged Britain, the young princess also wanted to do her part, as did many other women in the country. When Princess Elizabeth turned 18 in 1944, she insisted on joining the Auxiliary Territorial Service, the women's branch of the British Army. For several years during the war, Britain had enforced mandatory military service for women to join the armed forces, or work in agriculture or industry, especially for unmarried women under 30 years old. Princess Elizabeth began her training as a mechanic in March 1945. Based at the No. 1 Mechanical Transport Training Wing of the ATS in Camberley, Surrey. She worked 7 hours a day, but would return to Windsor Castle every night for rest. King George VI and his wife visited the training camp with Princess Margaret, witnessing their daughter learning about engine maintenance. She underwent a 6-week course in driving and vehicle maintenance at Aldershot. Newspapers at the time nicknamed her Princess Auto Mechanic. The end of the war in Europe finally arrived in May 1945, well before the princess completed her training. However, this did not deter her from finishing her training. Princess Elizabeth passed her final exam, driving from Camberley to London on her own, just like other recruits. In the end, she completed her service with the rank of junior commander, or equivalent to captain. On May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, thousands of people flooded the streets of London to celebrate, overflowing Trafalgar Square and the Mall, leading to Buckingham Palace, where the King and Queen welcomed them from the balcony. Interestingly, as the celebrations seemed set to continue into the evening, Princess Elizabeth, wearing her ATS uniform, slipped into the crowd with her sister, to enjoy the festivities. In 1985, the Queen spoke to the BBC about how she tried to avoid being recognized. Because the princess was very afraid of being recognized, she wore her ATS uniform and covered her face with a hat. The Queen described a line of unknown people holding hands and walking down Whitehall, and we were swept along in a wave of happiness and relief. There are reports that the princesses even joined a conga line at the Ritz Hotel, as they celebrated with the crowd.